The roar of the river drowned out every other sound in the wild expanse of Texas, as Daisy Zimmerman's body was swept violently downstream, her golden hair splaying across the churning surface like scattered wheat. She hadn't meant to wade in so deep, but the deceptively calm waters of the Brazos River had other plans on that sweltering July afternoon in 1875. Hayes Xavier was watering his stallion at a bend downstream when he spotted something unusual moving with the current. Squinting against the harsh sunlight glinting off the water, he recognized the unmistakable shape of a woman's dress billowing in the rapids. Without a moment's hesitation, he yanked off his boots, tossed his hat to the ground, and plunged into the frigid water. "Hold on," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the thunderous rapids. The current pulled at his limbs as he fought against nature itself, powerful strokes cutting through the water toward the limp form being tossed mercilessly by the river. Daisy had stopped fighting. Her lungs burned for air, her strength completely sapped by her battle against the relentless flow. The world was fading to a pleasant, distant blur when strong arms suddenly wrapped around her waist. The shock of human contact jolted her back to consciousness as she was pulled against a solid chest. "I've got you," a deep voice rumbled against her ear. "Don't fight me." Hayes kicked powerfully, angling them toward the shore while keeping the woman's head above water. The current fought him, trying to claim them both, but Hayes had grown up swimming in these waters and knew their temperament. With one arm locked around the woman's waist, he used the other to guide them toward a shallow eddy where the river's fury abated. His boots sank into the muddy riverbank as he carried her to dry land, laying her gently on a patch of grass. Her face was pale beneath streaks of wet hair, lips tinged with blue. "Miss, can you hear me?" Hayes pressed his ear to her chest, hearing a faint heartbeat. Without hesitation, he rolled her onto her side, patting her back firmly. Daisy coughed violently, river water spilling from her mouth as her body convulsed. Air rushed into her starved lungs and she gasped desperately, clinging to consciousness. "That's it," Hayes encouraged, supporting her shoulders. "Breathe." When her coughing subsided, Daisy blinked up at her rescuer. The afternoon sun haloed his dripping dark hair, water streaming from his square jaw. His eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue, studied her with concern. "You're safe now," he said, his voice as steady as his gaze. Daisy tried to speak, but another fit of coughing overtook her. Hayes patted her back again, his touch gentle despite his weathered appearance. "Don't try to talk just yet. Rest a moment." She nodded weakly, taking in her surroundings. Her sodden dress clung uncomfortably to her skin, and she was acutely aware of how improper she must look. Yet the stranger's eyes never wandered inappropriately. They remained fixed on her face with genuine concern. "I'm Hayes Xavier," he said, removing his soaked shirt and wringing it out. The muscles of his chest and arms flexed with the motion, bronzed from long days working under the Texas sun. He quickly put the damp shirt back on, seeming to sense her discomfort. "I have a cabin not far from here. Can you walk? You need dry clothes and warmth." "Daisy," she managed between ragged breaths. "Daisy Zimmerman. I can walk." Hayes helped her to her feet, but her legs buckled immediately. Without comment, he swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "My horse is just upstream," he said, carrying her along the riverbank. "He'll get us to shelter quicker." The magnificent black stallion was still waiting where Hayes had left him, reins loosely looped around a branch. He whistled, and the horse trotted over obediently. "This is midnight," Hayes said, carefully setting Daisy on her feet and keeping a steadying arm around her waist. "He's the best horse in the territory." Hayes helped her mount before swinging up behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Daisy felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back. Despite her exhaustion, she was acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation, a strange man taking her to his home, their bodies pressed together on horseback. Yet what choice did she have? She was miles from Eagle Pass, soaked to the bone and still weak from her near drowning. "My family," she said suddenly. "They'll be worried. I was supposed to return before sundown." "We'll send word once you're dry and rested," Hayes assured her. "Where do they live?" "The Zimmerman place, just outside Eagle Pass. My father is Daniel Zimmerman, the banker." Hayes nodded, his expression revealing nothing about what he thought of her family's position. "I know of your father. Don't worry, Miss Zimmerman. I'll get word to your family." The cabin appeared before them, nestled against a copse of oak trees a quarter-mile from the river. It was small but well built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A corral stood empty nearby, and a small vegetable garden grew alongside one wall. Hayes dismounted first, then reached up to help Daisy down. Her legs trembled beneath her weight, but she managed to stand with his support. He led her to the cabin door, pushing it open and guiding her inside. The interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cookstove beside it. A table and 2 chairs stood in the center, while a bed with a patchwork quilt occupied one corner. A trunk and dresser completed the furnishings. "Wait here," Hayes said, settling her in a chair. He quickly built a fire in the hearth, then rummaged in the trunk. "These belong to my sister. They might be a bit large, but they're dry." He handed her a simple cotton dress and undergarments, then pointed to a screen in the corner. "You can change behind there. I'll step outside to tend to midnight." When Hayes returned 10 minutes later, Daisy was sitting by the fire in the borrowed clothing. Her wet hair was combed back from her face, and color had returned to her cheeks. The dress hung loose on her slender frame, but it was clean and dry. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," she said as he entered. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Hayes hung his hat on a peg by the door. "No need for repayment. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Daisy said quietly. "Not anyone would have risked their life as you did." Hayes busied himself at the stove, avoiding her gaze. "Are you hungry? I was about to make some supper when I spotted you in the river." "A little," she admitted, "but I shouldn't impose further. If you could help me get word to my family—" "It's nearly dark," Hayes interrupted, gesturing toward the window where twilight was rapidly descending. "The trail to town is treacherous at night, especially for someone in your condition. You should rest here tonight, and I'll take you home at first light." Daisy hesitated, acutely aware of what staying the night in a stranger's cabin would do to her reputation if anyone discovered it. Yet Hayes had made no inappropriate advances, and the thought of riding through the darkness in her weakened state was daunting. "Where will you sleep?" she asked cautiously. "On the porch," Hayes answered immediately. "I've slept under the stars many nights. One more won't hurt me." His straightforward response eased her concerns. "Very well, Mr. Xavier. I accept your hospitality until morning." Hayes nodded, turning back to the stove. "Call me Hayes. Mr. Xavier makes me sound like my father." As he prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, Daisy studied her rescuer. He moved with the confident grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. His dark hair curled slightly as it dried, and the firelight caught the angles of his face, highlighting a small scar near his right temple. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, breaking the silence. "About 3 years," Hayes replied. "Bought this land after driving cattle up to Kansas." "You're a cowboy, then?" A faint smile touched his lips. "I was. Now I raise horses. I've got 8 fine mares and a stallion pastured about a mile from here. I'm building a ranch bit by bit." "Alone," Hayes nodded, placing a plate of food before her. "For now." My foreman, Thomas, helps with the horses, but he stays in the bunkhouse by the pasture. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire filling the room with warmth. Daisy found herself unexpectedly comfortable in Hayes's presence. There was something reassuring about his quiet confidence. "What brought you to the river today?" Hayes asked as they finished eating. Daisy looked down at her empty plate. "I was gathering wildflowers, my mother." She paused, swallowing hard. "My mother passed away last month. The flowers along the riverbank were her favorite." Hayes's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I thought the river looked calm enough to wade across to reach a particularly beautiful patch on the other side. I didn't realize how deceptive the current could be." "The Brazos is notorious for hiding its strength," Hayes said. "Even experienced swimmers can be caught off guard." "I've learned that lesson," Daisy said with a rueful smile. As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed more easily. Hayes told her about his years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, about the wild country he'd seen, and the characters he'd met. Daisy spoke of her life in Eagle Pass, her education at a ladies' seminary in San Antonio, and her return home to care for her ailing mother. "My father wants me to marry Randall Prescott," she admitted, surprising herself with her candor. "He's the son of father's business partner." "And you?" Hayes asked, his gray-blue eyes studying her. "What do you want?" The question startled Daisy. Few had ever asked what she wanted. "I'm not certain," she replied honestly. "Not Randall, though. He's kind enough, but there's no spark." Hayes nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Life's too short to tie yourself to someone who doesn't light a fire in your heart." His words lingered in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Daisy felt her cheeks warm and she looked away. "You should rest," Hayes said, rising from his chair. "Take the bed. I'll be on the porch if you need anything." He gathered a spare blanket from the trunk and moved toward the door. "Hayes," Daisy called softly. He turned, his hand on the latch. "Thank you, not just for saving me from the river, but for treating me with such respect." A smile softened his rugged features. "Good night, Daisy." As she lay in his bed that night, surrounded by the scent of leather and pine that seemed to emanate from the quilt, Daisy found herself thinking of Hayes Xavier's strong arms pulling her from the river, of the kindness in his eyes, and of the strange fluttering in her chest when he spoke of fires in the heart. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin's small windows. Daisy woke to the aroma of coffee and bacon and the soft sounds of movement in the room. Opening her eyes, she found Hayes at the stove, his back to her as he prepared breakfast. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and quickly smoothing her borrowed dress. Hayes turned, coffee pot in hand. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Much better," she replied, and it was true. The weakness from her ordeal had largely faded, though her muscles ached in protest when she rose from the bed. "I thought we might head to town after breakfast," Hayes said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Your father must be worried sick." Daisy accepted the cup he offered. "Yes, I'm sure there's a search party out looking for me by now." They ate quickly, and Hayes insisted Daisy take his spare coat for the journey as the morning air held a chill. Her own clothes, still damp, were carefully wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tied behind the saddle. The ride to Eagle Pass took nearly 2 hours, during which they passed through rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak. As they traveled, Daisy found herself wishing the journey would last longer. There was something about Hayes Xavier that intrigued her, a quiet strength, an honest directness that differed so drastically from the calculated politeness of the men in her social circle. "There it is," Hayes said as Eagle Pass came into view, the small frontier town nestled along the Rio Grande. Your father's bank is on Main Street, isn't it? Yes, but our home is on the north side of town, Daisy replied. We should go there first. As they approached the Zimmerman residence, a stately two-story home with a wide front porch, they saw a flurry of activity. Several horses were hitched outside, and men were gathered in conversation near the gate. Daisy, a tall man with graying hair, broke away from the group, rushing toward them as Hayes helped Daisy dismount. My God, we thought you were dead. Daniel Zimmerman pulled his daughter into a fierce embrace, then held her at arm's length, examining her for injury. What happened? Where have you been? Before Daisy could explain, her father's gaze shifted to Hayes, suspicion clouding his features. Who is this man? Father, this is Hayes Xavier, Daisy said quickly. He saved my life. I was crossing the Brazos River and got caught in the current. If not for Mr. Xavier, I would have drowned. Daniel's expression changed instantly. He extended his hand to Hayes. Mr. Xavier, I am forever in your debt. Please come inside. You must tell us everything. Hayes removed his hat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. No need for thanks, sir. I'm just glad Miss Zimmerman is safe. I should be getting back to my ranch. Nonsense, Daniel insisted. At the very least, allow us to offer you a proper meal and compensation for your trouble. I require no payment for doing what any decent man would do, Hayes said firmly. Then a meal and our gratitude, Daniel countered. I won't take no for an answer. Hayes glanced at Daisy, who offered a small smile of encouragement. Very well, sir. Thank you. Inside the Zimmerman home, the contrast with Hayes's simple cabin could not have been more striking. Polished wooden floors stretched beneath ornate rugs, and the furniture spoke of wealth and taste. Daisy excused herself to change into proper clothing, leaving Hayes alone with her father in the parlor. When she returned, wearing a blue dress that complimented her eyes, she found the two men engaged in conversation about horses. Her father, an enthusiastic rider himself, was clearly impressed by Hayes's knowledge. Daisy tells me you're building a ranch, Daniel said as a maid served coffee. Where exactly is your property? About 15 miles northeast of town, Hayes replied. It's not much yet, but I've got good grazing land and clean water. And you raise horses exclusively? No cattle? For now, yes. Quarter horses mainly, with a few thoroughbred crosses. I'm focusing on breeding stock for ranchers and quality mounts for private buyers. Daniel nodded approvingly. A wise choice. There's always a market for good horses in these parts. The conversation continued through lunch, with Daniel drawing out Hayes's background and business plans with the practiced ease of a banker assessing a potential client. To Daisy's surprise, Hayes held his own admirably, speaking knowledgeably about his operation and his goals for expansion. You should join us for dinner on Saturday, Daniel said as the meal concluded. We're hosting several of the town's prominent citizens. It would be an excellent opportunity for you to make connections that might benefit your business. Hayes hesitated, glancing at Daisy. That's very kind, sir, but I'm not much for social gatherings. Please consider it, Daisy said, meeting his gaze. It would mean a great deal to me to properly thank you for saving my life. Something flickered in Hayes's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or a reluctance to step into Daisy's world of wealth and social standing. But after a moment he nodded. All right. Saturday evening, then. As Hayes prepared to leave, Daisy walked with him to the front porch while her father settled back in his study. Thank you again, she said quietly. Not just for the rescue, but for coming to town with me. Father can be intimidating, Hayes smiled, placing his hat back on his head. He seems like a good man who loves his daughter very much. He is, Daisy agreed, though sometimes his ideas about what's best for me differ from my own. Like Randall Prescott, Hayes asked, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Daisy nodded. "He'll be at dinner on Saturday." "Fair warning. Then I'll be sure to wear my best shirt," Hayes replied with a hint of humor. "Wouldn't want to embarrass you in front of your suitor." "He's not my suitor," Daisy said quickly. "Not by my choice, anyway." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to still around them. Then Hayes tipped his hat slightly. "Until Saturday, Miss Zimmerman." Daisy watched him ride away, his straight-backed figure gradually diminishing in the distance. She remained on the porch long after he disappeared from view, wondering why the thought of seeing Hayes Xavier again in 3 days' time made her heart beat faster than it had in years. The days leading up to Saturday seemed to drag endlessly for Daisy. She found herself distracted during her usual activities, her thoughts drifting repeatedly to the cabin by the river and the man who had saved her life. Several times, she caught herself staring out windows in the direction of Hayes's ranch, wondering what he was doing at that moment. "You seem preoccupied, daughter," Daniel remarked over breakfast on Saturday morning. "Are you feeling unwell? Perhaps a lingering effect from your ordeal?" "I'm perfectly fine, Father," Daisy assured him. "Just thinking about the dinner preparations for tonight." Daniel nodded approvingly. "I've invited the Prescotts, the Montgomerys, Judge Wilson and his wife, and of course your rescuer, Mr. Xavier." He paused, studying her face. "Randall has been asking about you. He was quite distraught when you went missing." Daisy maintained a neutral expression. "That's very kind of him." "He's a fine young man with excellent prospects," Daniel continued, his tone casual but his meaning clear. "His father and I have discussed the possibility of merging our banking interests. Such an arrangement would be beneficial for both families." "I'm sure it would be," Daisy replied diplomatically, "from a business perspective." Daniel sighed, setting down his coffee cup. "Daisy, I only want what's best for you. Since your mother's passing, I've worried about your future. Randall could provide security, position, a good life." "I know, Father," Daisy said softly. "But shouldn't there be more to marriage than security and position?" Before Daniel could respond, the housekeeper entered to discuss the evening's menu, ending their conversation. Daisy excused herself, grateful for the interruption. She spent the rest of the morning helping with preparations for the dinner party, though her thoughts remained divided. By evening, the Zimmerman home was transformed for the occasion. Fresh flowers adorned every table, candles glowed in silver holders, and the dining room table was set with the family's finest china. Daisy dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk that her mother had helped her choose during their last trip to San Antonio. The color brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes and complemented her honey blonde hair, which she wore partially up, with soft curls framing her face. The first guests arrived promptly at 7. Judge Wilson and his wife, followed shortly by the Montgomerys. The Prescotts came next, with Randall immediately seeking out Daisy. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, bowing slightly. "You look absolutely radiant this evening. We were all so relieved to hear of your safe return." Randall Prescott was handsome in a conventional way, tall and well-proportioned, with neatly trimmed brown hair and an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. His manners were impeccable, his conversation pleasant if somewhat predictable. By all accounts, he was exactly the sort of man a banker's daughter should be delighted to marry. Yet as Daisy exchanged pleasantries with him, she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the entrance, wondering if Hayes would actually come. "I understand we're to meet your rescuer tonight," Randall said, following her gaze. "Some sort of horse breeder, I hear." "Yes, Mr. Xavier has a ranch northeast of town," Daisy replied. "He raises some of the finest horses in the territory." Randall raised an eyebrow. "Indeed." "Well, We must be sure to thank him properly for saving Eagle Pass's most beautiful young lady." Just then, the butler announced a new arrival, Mr. Hayes Xavier. All heads turned toward the entrance, and Daisy felt her breath catch. Hayes stood in the doorway, almost unrecognizable from the man she'd met by the river. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He wore a black suit that, while not as fashionable as Randall's, fit his broad shoulders perfectly. A crisp white shirt and string tie completed the transformation. Daniel Zimmerman crossed the room to greet him. "Mr. Xavier, welcome to our home." Hayes shook Daniel's hand. "Thank you for the invitation, sir. Come, let me introduce you to our other guests." As Hayes was led around the room, Daisy watched the reactions. The men regarded him with curiosity, the women with varying degrees of interest. Judge Wilson, a former Texas Ranger, seemed particularly taken with Hayes after learning he'd once driven cattle on the Kishome Trail. When Hayes finally reached Daisy and Randall, his gray-blue eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, his deep voice sending an unexpected shiver through her. "You look well." "Thanks to you, Mr. Xavier," she replied, acutely aware of Randall watching their exchange. "May I present Mr. Randall Prescott? Mr. Prescott, this is Mr. Hayes Xavier, to whom I owe my life." The two men sized each other up as they shook hands. "A pleasure," Randall said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We're all quite grateful for your heroic actions, Mr. Xavier." "Just happened to be in the right place," Hayes said modestly. His gaze returned to Daisy. "Miss Zimmerman did the hard part by holding on until I reached her." "Still, not every man would have risked his own life," Daisy said, "especially for a stranger." Something unspoken passed between them, a current as tangible as the one that had nearly claimed her life. Randall cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Mr. Xavier, I understand you're in the horse business," he said. "My father's bank finances several ranching operations in the area. Perhaps we should discuss your enterprise sometime." "I appreciate the offer," Hayes replied evenly, "but I've managed to build my operation without taking on debt so far." Randall's smile tightened. "Admirable, but limiting. Growth requires capital, Mr. Xavier. The right financial partner could help you expand much faster." "Maybe so," Hayes acknowledged, "but I prefer to grow at a pace I can control completely." The butler announced dinner before the conversation could continue, and the guests moved toward the dining room. Daisy found herself seated between Randall and Judge Wilson's wife, with Hayes positioned directly across from her. Throughout the meal, she was conscious of his presence, occasionally catching his eye across the table as the conversation flowed around them. Hayes spoke little unless directly addressed, but when he did contribute, his comments were thoughtful and informed. When the discussion turned to the changing landscape of Texas since the end of the Civil War, he offered insights that even the judge found enlightening. "You've seen quite a bit of the territory, then?" Judge Wilson asked. Hayes nodded. "From the Panhandle to the Gulf and most places in between. Things are changing fast. The open range won't last much longer, not with the railroads pushing further south and settlers coming in." "Progress is inevitable," Daniel Zimmerman commented, "and necessary for growth. The wild days of Texas are behind us, thankfully." "There's still plenty of wild left," Hayes replied, "but you're right about progress. The question is whether we're progressing in the right direction." "What direction would you suggest, Mr. Xavier?" Randall asked, his tone slightly challenging. Hayes considered the question. "One that respects the land and the people who were here before us. The Comanche and Apache knew how to live in balance with this country. We could learn from that, instead of just conquering and dividing." A brief silence followed his words. Such sentiments weren't commonly expressed in Eagle Pass drawing rooms. An interesting perspective, Daniel said diplomatically. Though I imagine the families who have lost loved ones to Indian raids might disagree. There's been wrong on both sides, Hayes acknowledged. I've seen it firsthand, but the future doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Daisy found herself admiring Hayes's willingness to speak his mind, even when his views differed from those around him. Randall, she noted, seemed less impressed. Rather philosophical for a horse breeder, he remarked with a thin smile. Life on the trail gives a man plenty of time to think, Hayes replied evenly, and to observe the consequences of other men's decisions. After dinner, the party moved to the parlor for coffee and dessert. Randall remained close to Daisy's side, while Hayes fell into conversation with Judge Wilson about the changing legal landscape of the territory. Daisy found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on Randall's discussion of his recent business trip to Austin, her attention continually drawn to Hayes's deep voice across the room. When Randall excused himself to speak with his father, Daisy seized the opportunity to approach Hayes, who was now examining a painting on the wall. "Are you finding the evening tolerable, Mr. Xavier?" she asked quietly. He turned to her with a hint of a smile. "More than tolerable, Miss Zimmerman. Your father has been very gracious. And the company, varied and educational," he replied diplomatically. Daisy laughed softly. "A diplomatic answer. I appreciate your patience with Mr. Prescott. He can be rather assertive about his views." "He seems very attentive to you," Hayes observed, his expression carefully neutral. "By my father's arrangement, not my choice," Daisy reminded him. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then added in a lower voice, "I've been wondering something since the day you rescued me." "What's that?" "What made you dive into the river without hesitation? You couldn't have known who I was or whether you could reach me in time. You risked your life for a complete stranger." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his gray-blue eyes studying her face. "Some decisions don't require thinking, Miss Zimmerman. They're made in the heart, not the head." The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep within Daisy. Before she could respond, Randall returned to her side, slipping a possessive hand beneath her elbow. "Your father is asking for you, Daisy," he said, the familiar use of her first name clearly intended to establish his position. "Something about bringing out your mother's special dessert wine." "Of course," Daisy replied, reluctantly moving away from Hayes. "Please excuse me, Mr. Xavier." As the evening progressed, Daisy found fewer opportunities to speak with Hayes. Randall seemed determined to keep her attention, while the other guests frequently engaged Hayes in conversation, curious about the man who had saved Daniel Zimmerman's daughter. By the time the party began to disperse, Daisy felt a surprising sense of disappointment. She had hoped for more time with Hayes, to understand better the man who had so dramatically entered her life. As he prepared to depart, she managed to reach the door before him. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "I know this isn't your usual element." Hayes smiled, the gesture warming his usually serious face. "It was worth it to see you fully recovered." "Perhaps you might call again sometime," Daisy suggested, aware that she was being forward but unable to help herself. "Father would welcome the chance to discuss horses with you further." "Would his daughter welcome it as well?" Hayes asked quietly. "Very much so," Daisy replied, meeting his gaze directly. Something shifted in Hayes's expression, a softening, a decision made. "Then I'll call next week if that would be acceptable." "More than acceptable, Mr. Xavier." As Hayes rode away from the Zimmerman home, Daisy stood at the parlor window, watching until he disappeared into the darkness. Behind her, She could hear Randall's voice as he discussed business with her father, but her thoughts were elsewhere, following a lone rider on the trail out of town, wondering what possibilities lay ahead. True to his word, Hayes called at the Zimmerman home the following week. He arrived on Wednesday afternoon, dressed in clean but practical clothing, more the horse breeder than the dinner guest. Daniel welcomed him warmly, clearly pleased by the visit. "Mr. Xavier, what a pleasant surprise. Please come in." "I hope I'm not intruding," Hayes said as he entered, hat in hand. "I was in town on business and thought I'd stop by to see how Miss Zimmerman is faring." "Not intruding at all," Daniel assured him. "Daisy will be delighted. She's in the garden." Daniel led Hayes through the house to the rear door, which opened onto a well-tended garden where Daisy was carefully trimming roses. She wore a simple day dress and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the sun. At the sound of footsteps, she looked up, her expression brightening visibly when she recognized Hayes. "Mr. Xavier, what a lovely surprise." "I'll leave you two to visit," Daniel said. "I have some correspondence to attend to." "Mr. Xavier, you're welcome to stay for tea if your business in town allows." Once her father had returned to the house, Daisy gestured to a nearby bench. "Please join me. I was just about finished with these roses." Hayes sat, looking slightly out of place in the carefully manicured garden. "Your flowers are beautiful. Thank you. My mother started this garden when I was a child. Tending it helps me feel close to her," Daisy said, setting aside her shears. "What brings you to town today?" "Ordered some new tack from the saddlery," Hayes replied. "And brought in 2 horses for a buyer from San Antonio. A successful transaction, I hope." "Very. He took both horses and commissioned 2 more for next spring." Hayes paused, then added, "But that's not the only reason I came to Eagle Pass today." Daisy met his gaze questioningly. "I wanted to see you," he admitted, "to make sure you were truly recovered from your ordeal in the river." "As you can see, I'm fully restored," Daisy replied, touched by his concern. "Thanks to you." Hayes shook his head slightly. "You needn't keep thanking me, Miss Zimmerman." "Daisy," she corrected gently. "Please, after what we've been through, I think you can call me Daisy." A smile touched his lips. "Daisy, then." Their conversation flowed easily as they sat in the garden. Hayes told her about his plans for expanding his horse breeding operation, while Daisy spoke of her involvement with the town's small library and her efforts to establish a proper school for the children of Eagle Pass. "Education was important to my mother," she explained. "She taught at a ladies' seminary before marrying father. I'd like to continue her legacy in some small way." "It's a worthy goal," Hayes said. "A town grows stronger when its children learn to think for themselves." As they talked, Daisy found herself increasingly drawn to Hayes's straightforward manner and thoughtful perspectives. Unlike many men of her acquaintance, he listened carefully when she spoke, engaging with her ideas rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. When the housekeeper brought tea, they moved to a small table on the porch. Hayes initially seemed uncomfortable with the formal service, but soon relaxed as Daisy kept the conversation flowing. "May I ask you something personal?" Daisy ventured as they finished their tea. Hayes nodded. "You may ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough," she said with a smile. "You mentioned a sister, the one whose clothes I borrowed. Is she nearby?" A shadow crossed Hayes's face. "No, Sarah died 3 years ago, typhoid." "I'm so sorry," Daisy said softly. "That's why you keep her things." Hayes nodded. "She was all the family I had left. Our parents died when we were young. We made our way together until—" He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "Her illness is what brought me to this area. She wanted to see the river country before she passed." Daisy reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for lending me her clothes that day. It must have been difficult." Actually, Hayes said, his expression softening, I think she would have liked you. Sarah never stood on ceremony either. The simple statement touched Daisy deeply. Before she could respond, the front gate opened, and Randall Prescott walked up the path toward the house. His stride faltered momentarily when he spotted Hayes sitting with Daisy, but he quickly recovered, plastering a smile on his face. "Miss Zimmerman," he called. "What a fortunate coincidence. I was just passing and thought I'd pay my respects." Daisy rose to greet him, acutely aware of Hayes also standing. "Mr. Prescott, good afternoon. You remember Mr. Xavier?" "Of course," Randall said, his smile not reaching his eyes as he nodded to Hayes. "The horse breeder. I trust your business in town was successful today." "Very," Hayes replied simply. An awkward silence fell, broken when Daisy offered, "Would you care for some tea, Mr. Prescott?" "We were just finishing, but I'm sure the housekeeper could bring another cup." "Thank you, but I can't stay long," Randall replied. "I merely wanted to deliver this personally." He produced a small envelope from his jacket pocket, an invitation to a gathering at our home next weekend. "My mother is hosting a musical evening. Your father has already accepted." "How lovely," Daisy said, taking the envelope. "Please thank your mother for thinking of us." "The invitation extends to your father's guests as well, of course," Randall added, glancing at Hayes with a smile that suggested the opposite of his words. "That's very generous," Hayes said, clearly recognizing the implied challenge. "Unfortunately, I'll be traveling to Austin next week to look at a stallion I'm considering purchasing." "What a shame," Randall replied, not bothering to hide his relief. "Another time, perhaps. I should be going," Hayes said, turning to Daisy. "Thank you for the tea and conversation, Miss Zimmerman." "It was my pleasure, Mr. Xavier," Daisy replied. "I hope you'll call again when your business allows." Hayes nodded, then tipped his hat to Randall before departing. Daisy watched him go, aware of Randall's eyes on her face. "He seems to have made quite an impression on you," Randall observed once Hayes was out of earshot. "He saved my life, Mr. Prescott," Daisy reminded him. "That tends to create a certain bond." "Of course," Randall conceded, "and your father's gratitude is understandable. I simply wonder if perhaps Mr. Xavier might be misinterpreting the nature of that gratitude." Daisy turned to face him directly. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Prescott?" Randall had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Merely that a man in Mr. Xavier's position might develop aspirations beyond his station when shown such appreciation by a family like yours." "His position," Daisy repeated, her tone cooling. "You mean as a successful ranch owner who built his business through hard work and determination? Or do you refer to his character as a man willing to risk his life for a stranger?" "Daisy," Randall said, dropping the formality in his frustration, "you must understand how people might talk if you encourage his attentions. Your father's position in this community demands certain standards in your associations." "I believe my father is quite capable of judging the character of the people I associate with," Daisy replied evenly. "As am I." Before Randall could respond, Daniel Zimmerman appeared in the doorway. "Randall, I thought I heard your voice. Will you join me in my study? I've just received some interesting reports from our Houston correspondent." Clearly relieved by the interruption, Randall nodded. "Of course, sir. I'd be delighted." As the men disappeared into the house, Daisy remained on the porch, her thoughts in turmoil. Randall's implications about Hayes had angered her, but they also forced her to confront questions she'd been avoiding. Why was she so drawn to Hayes Xavier? Was it merely gratitude for his heroic act, or something deeper? And what could possibly come of such feelings, given the differences in their backgrounds and circumstances? Over the following weeks, Hayes called at the Zimmerman home several more times. Each visit deepened Daisy's fascination with him, as she discovered new facets of his character and history. He spoke of his time in the war reluctantly at first, then more openly as she proved a sympathetic listener. Though only a boy when the conflict began, he joined a Texas cavalry unit at 16 and seen action at Galveston and in Louisiana. "I was lucky," he told her during one of their conversations in the garden. "Many weren't." Daniel Zimmerman, for his part, seemed to approve of Hayes's visits, often inviting him to stay for meals and engaging him in lengthy discussions about horses and ranching. To Daisy's surprise, her father showed genuine interest in Hayes's breeding program and plans for expansion. "Xavier has a good head on his shoulders," Daniel remarked to Daisy one evening after Hayes had departed. "Self-made men often have a clearer understanding of value than those who inherit their position." Daisy wondered if her father was referring to Randall, whose business acumen was largely untested, having worked only within the protective confines of his father's bank. She chose her words carefully in response. "Mr. Xavier has certainly overcome significant challenges to build his ranch. His knowledge of horses is remarkable." Daniel studied his daughter's face. "You've grown quite fond of him, haven't you?" The direct question caught Daisy off guard. "I admire his character and enjoy his company," she admitted. "And Randall Prescott?" Daniel asked. "How do you feel about him?" Daisy hesitated. "Randall is precisely what he appears to be, a respectable banker's son with impeccable manners and conventional opinions." Daniel chuckled. "That's a diplomatic way of saying he bores you to tears." "Father!" Daisy exclaimed, shocked by his perception. "My dear, I may be focused on my business, but I'm not blind," Daniel said gently. "I've seen how your eyes light up when Xavier arrives and how they don't when Prescott calls." "I thought you favored a match with Randall," Daisy said cautiously. Daniel sighed, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "I favored what I believed would give you security and standing in the community. Your mother's illness and passing. It made me overly concerned with ensuring your future." He took her hand. "But Elizabeth would scold me terribly if I pushed you toward a loveless marriage simply for business advantages." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes at the mention of her mother. "What are you saying, Father?" "I'm saying that I want you to follow your heart, just as your mother and I did," Daniel replied. "The Prescotts would make powerful allies, yes, but that's not reason enough to spend a lifetime with someone who doesn't make your spirit soar." Daisy leaned forward to embrace her father. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel patted her back. "Don't thank me yet. I'm not giving carte blanche to any suitor who catches your eye. Xavier has proven himself a man of character, but if he wishes to court you properly, he'll need to demonstrate his intentions are honorable and his prospects secure." "Of course," Daisy agreed, though inwardly she wondered if Hayes had any intention of courting her at all. Despite their growing friendship, he had never explicitly expressed romantic interest. Perhaps he viewed her only as a friend, or worse, as an obligation due to the circumstances of their meeting. Her uncertainty was resolved the following week when Hayes arrived at the Zimmerman home with an unusual request. "I'd like to show you my ranch," he said as they walked in the garden. "With your father's permission, of course. My foreman's wife would accompany us as chaperone." Daisy's heart quickened at the invitation. "I'd like that very much." Daniel gave his consent, though not without certain conditions. Hayes was to bring Daisy home before sundown, and Thomas's wife, Martha, was to remain with them throughout the visit. Hayes readily agreed to these terms, arranging to collect Daisy the following Saturday morning. The day dawned clear and mild, perfect for the journey to Hayes's ranch. He arrived promptly at 9, driving a well-maintained buggy. Martha, a pleasant woman in her 40s, greeted Daisy warmly as she settled beside her on the seat, with Hayes taking the reins. The 15-mile journey passed quickly as Hayes pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the territory. As they approached his property, Daisy was struck by the natural beauty of the location, rolling grasslands bordered by stands of oak and mesquite, with a clear creek winding through the valley. "It's lovely," she said, as the ranch buildings came into view. "So peaceful." "That's what drew me to this spot," Hayes replied. "The first time I saw this valley, I knew this was where I wanted to build something lasting." The main house was larger than the cabin where Daisy had stayed after her rescue, a sturdy structure built of stone and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a barn, corral, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all well constructed and maintained. Hayes helped the women down from the buggy, then offered Daisy his arm. "Would you like to see the horses first, or would you prefer to rest from the journey?" "The horses, please," Daisy replied eagerly. "I've been looking forward to seeing them." Hayes led her to a large paddock where several mares grazed with their foals. "These are the foundation of my breeding program," he explained. Each was chosen for specific qualities: intelligence, endurance, conformation. As Hayes spoke about his horses, his passion was evident in every word and gesture. He called each mare by name, describing her lineage and the qualities she passed to her offspring. The animals clearly knew and trusted him, approaching the fence when he whistled softly. "They're magnificent," Daisy said, delighting in the sight of a foal prancing beside its mother. "You must be very proud." "I am," Hayes admitted, "though there's still much to accomplish. Come, I'll show you my pride and joy." He led her to another paddock where a powerful black stallion stood watching their approach, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. "Midnight." Daisy recognized the horse that had carried them both from the river. Hayes nodded. "The best horse I've ever known. Every foal he sires has his intelligence and spirit." After touring the rest of the ranch, they returned to the house where Martha had prepared a simple but delicious meal. They ate on the porch, enjoying the view of the valley and the distant hills beyond. "You've built something remarkable here," Daisy said as they finished their meal. "In just 3 years." "It's only a beginning," Hayes replied. "I have plans for expansion, more breeding stock, better facilities, eventually a larger house." Something in his tone made Daisy look at him more closely. "A larger house? Are you planning to start a family?" Hayes met her gaze steadily. "That would depend on finding the right woman to share this life. It's not an easy existence, especially for someone accustomed to town comforts. Some women might prefer open spaces and honest work to parlor gatherings and social obligations," Daisy said quietly. "Would you be such a woman, Daisy?" Hayes asked, his voice low enough that Martha, busy clearing dishes, couldn't hear. The directness of his question sent a flush of warmth to Daisy's cheeks. I believe I might be, for the right person and purpose." Hayes reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers briefly. "That's good to know." The moment was interrupted by Martha announcing that she'd prepared coffee. But something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that neither had voiced before. On the journey back to Eagle Pass, they spoke of practical matters, the challenges of ranch life, the future of the territory, Daisy's continuing efforts to establish a proper school. Yet beneath the conversation ran a current of awareness, of questions not yet asked but hovering on the horizon. As they approached the Zimmerman home, Hayes slowed the buggy. "I've been invited to a cattle auction in San Antonio next week," he said. "I'll be gone for about 10 days. "I'll miss our conversations," Daisy admitted. "As will I," Hayes replied, "but the trip is necessary." I'm hoping to acquire new breeding stock and make connections with buyers from further east. Of course, Daisy said, understanding the importance of such business to his growing operation. I wish you success. When they arrived at her home, Hayes helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for visiting my ranch today," he said. "Seeing it through your eyes reminded me of how far it's come." "Thank you for showing me," Daisy replied. "It helps me understand you better." Hayes's expression softened. "When I return from San Antonio, there's something I'd like to discuss with you and your father." Daisy's heart skipped a beat at the implication of his words. "I look forward to that conversation." As Hayes drove away with Martha beside him, Daisy felt a curious mixture of excitement and trepidation. The direction of their relationship was changing, moving toward something more defined than friendship. The prospect both thrilled and frightened her, for despite their growing attachment, significant questions remained about how their different worlds could possibly merge. The days of Hayes's absence stretched interminably for Daisy. She filled her time with her usual activities, helping at the library, meeting with other young women about the school project, attending to household matters, but her thoughts frequently drifted to the ranch in the valley and its owner. Randall Prescott called twice during this period, clearly hoping to take advantage of Hayes's absence to reassert his position. During his second visit, he broached the subject directly. "Your father and mine have been discussing our future, Daisy," he said as they sat in the parlor. "I believe the time has come for us to consider a formal understanding." Daisy maintained her composure, though inwardly she bristled at his presumption. "What sort of understanding do you mean, Mr. Prescott?" "An engagement, of course," Randall replied, seemingly oblivious to her cool tone. "Our families are ideally suited to alliance, both socially and financially, and I believe we could build a compatible partnership." "Compatible," Daisy repeated. "That's hardly the most romantic proposal a woman might hope for." Randall looked momentarily flustered. "I didn't mean—" "That is, I hold you in the highest regard, Daisy. Your refinement, your education, your family position, all are admirable qualities in a future wife. And what of affection, Mr. Prescott? Of passion, of shared dreams and values? Do these not factor into your calculations?" "Affection grows in marriage," Randall said stiffly. "As for passion, such considerations are secondary to building a proper household and position in society." Daisy regarded him steadily. "I disagree, Mr. Prescott. I believe a marriage should be built on deeper foundations than social compatibility and business advantage." "You're speaking of love," Randall said, his expression suggesting he found the concept somewhat distasteful. "A romantic notion, but hardly practical as the primary basis for a lifelong union." "Yet it's the basis I require," Daisy replied firmly. "I cannot accept your proposal, Mr. Prescott. While I respect you and value our family's friendship, I do not share your feelings or vision for the future." Randall's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Is it Xavier? Has he turned your head with his heroics and rustic charm?" "My decision concerns only you and me," Daisy said evenly. "But I won't deny that knowing Mr. Xavier has shown me that a man can be both principled and passionate about his life's work, both strong and gentle in his dealings with others. He can offer you nothing comparable to what I can provide," Randall argued. "A rancher's wife leads a hard life, Daisy. You'd be isolated without the society you've always known, reduced to menial labor and endless childbearing. You understand very little about me if you believe those prospects would deter me from following my heart," Daisy replied. "Now, I think it best if you leave, Mr. Prescott. I'm sorry to have disappointed you, but my decision is final." Randall rose, his posture rigid with wounded pride. "You're making a grave mistake, Daisy. Your father will be most displeased." "My father wants my happiness above all," Daisy said confidently. "He's made that very clear." After Randall's departure, Daisy immediately sought out her father in his study, relating the conversation in full. To her relief, Daniel showed no anger at her rejection of Randall's proposal. "I suspected this might happen," he said with a sigh. "Prescott's father will be disappointed, but he'll recover. There are other banking alliances to be made." "And you're truly not upset?" Daisy asked. Daniel shook his head. "How could I be upset that my daughter refuses to settle for less than what her mother and I had? A marriage without love is a poor bargain, no matter how advantageous it may appear on paper." Daisy hugged her father tightly. "Thank you for understanding." "I assume Xavier will be calling when he returns from San Antonio?" Daniel asked, his tone casual but his eyes shrewd. "He mentioned wanting to speak with us both," Daisy admitted. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Then I look forward to the conversation." 2 days later, word reached Eagle Pass that Hayes Xavier had returned from San Antonio. The news came via Judge Wilson, who had encountered Hayes at the saddlery. "Said he'd made some excellent purchases," the judge told Daniel when they met on the street. "Bought 3 mares and arranged to purchase a young stallion from a breeder in Kentucky. Seems your friend's operation is expanding rapidly." Daisy tried to contain her anticipation, expecting Hayes to call at any moment, but 2 days passed with no word or visit. On the 3rd day, unable to bear the suspense any longer, she convinced her father to drive her to town on the pretext of visiting the dressmaker. While Daniel attended to business at the bank, Daisy made her way to the saddlery where Hayes had last been seen. The proprietor, Mr. Collins, greeted her warmly. "Miss Zimmerman, what brings you to my humble establishment? I was wondering if you'd seen Mr. Xavier recently," Daisy said, trying to sound casual. "I understand he returned from San Antonio several days ago." Collins's expression changed subtly. "He did indeed. Picked up his order just yesterday. Seemed in a hurry, though. Did he mention his plans? Not specifically, miss, but—" Collins hesitated. "There was talk at the saloon that he might be leaving the area. Johnson over at the land office mentioned something about Xavier inquiring about selling his property." Daisy felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. "Selling? But that can't be right. His ranch is thriving." Collins shrugged. "Just repeating what I heard, miss." Though he did seem preoccupied when he was here. Not his usual self at all. Thanking Collins, Daisy left the saddlery in a daze. Why would Hayes consider selling his ranch after all his hard work building it? And why hadn't he called on her as promised? The questions swirled in her mind as she walked slowly toward the bank to meet her father. As she passed the sheriff's office, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside. Curiosity drew her closer, where she overheard fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Xavier's foreman found him this morning. Beaten badly. 3 men jumped him on the trail." Pushing through the onlookers, Daisy entered the sheriff's office without hesitation. Inside, she found Hayes seated in a chair, his face bruised and cut, one arm bound in a makeshift sling. Thomas, his foreman, stood nearby speaking with Sheriff Blake. "Hayes," Daisy exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What happened?" Hayes looked up, surprise and something like embarrassment crossing his battered face. "Daisy, you shouldn't be here." "I most certainly should," she retorted, kneeling beside his chair and gently touching his uninjured arm. "What happened to you?" Sheriff Blake cleared his throat. "Miss Zimmerman, this is an official investigation." "Perhaps you should." "I was ambushed on my way back to the ranch last night," Hayes interrupted, his voice hoarse. 3 men. They wore bandanas over their faces. "Robbery," Daisy asked, though something in Hayes's expression told her there was more to the story. "That's what we're trying to determine," Sheriff Blake replied. Mr. Xavier had just withdrawn a substantial sum from the bank following his sales in San Antonio, but the money wasn't taken. "Then what was the purpose of the attack?" Daisy demanded. Thomas spoke up. "They told him to get out of Eagle Pass, said some things weren't meant to be." A cold realization washed over Daisy. "This was about me," she whispered, meeting Hayes's eyes. "Wasn't it?" Hayes didn't answer directly, but his gaze confirmed her suspicion. "It doesn't matter. I'm not easily intimidated." "Do you have any idea who might have done this, Miss Zimmerman?" Sheriff Blake asked, watching her reaction carefully. Daisy stood, straightening her shoulders. "I can't be certain, Sheriff, but I recently refused a marriage proposal from Randall Prescott. He was displeased." "That's a serious implication, miss," the sheriff warned. "The Prescotts are powerful in this town." "I'm not making accusations," Daisy replied, "merely stating facts that might be relevant to your investigation." At that moment, Daniel Zimmerman entered the office, having heard about the commotion. "Daisy, what's going on here?" His gaze fell on Hayes. "Good Lord, Xavier, what happened to you?" As the sheriff explained the situation, Daniel's expression darkened. When Daisy mentioned her suspicions regarding Randall, her father's jaw tightened ominously. "This is outrageous," he declared. "Xavier, you're coming home with us. You need proper medical attention and a safe place to recover." "That's not necessary," Hayes began, but Daniel cut him off. "It's not a request. Sheriff, I expect a thorough investigation. If you need my daughter's statement, you know where to find us." Despite Hayes's protests, Daniel insisted on bringing him to the Zimmerman home. The town doctor was summoned to attend to his injuries, confirming 2 broken ribs and a sprained shoulder in addition to the visible cuts and bruises. Throughout the examination, Daisy remained nearby, her concern evident in every glance and gesture. After the doctor departed, leaving Hayes resting in the guest bedroom, Daniel cornered his daughter in the hallway. "Tell me everything," he demanded quietly. "Is there truly reason to suspect Prescott?" Daisy related her conversation with Randall, including his bitter remarks about Hayes. "I can't prove he was involved, Father. But the timing, the warning to Hayes to leave Eagle Pass, the fact that the money wasn't taken, it all suggests this was personal, not random." Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Evidence, not suspicion, is required for justice. But I'll speak with Prescott Sr. privately. If his son was involved, there will be consequences." Later that evening, Daisy brought a tray of food to Hayes's room. He was sitting up in bed, his expression pained but alert. "You shouldn't be waiting on me," he said as she set the tray on the bedside table. "I want to," Daisy replied simply, pulling a chair close to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "I've been worse," Hayes said with a grimace that belied his words. "Your father's hospitality is generous but unnecessary. I could have recovered at my ranch. And risk another attack? I think not." Daisy poured him a cup of broth. "Besides, this gives me the opportunity to ask why you didn't call on me when you returned from San Antonio, as you promised." Hayes accepted the cup, his eyes not meeting hers. "I needed time to consider some matters. Mr. Collins at the saddlery mentioned you were asking about selling your property," Daisy said directly. "Is that true?" Hayes sighed, setting the cup down. "I made inquiries, yes. After what Randall Prescott said to me in San Antonio, I thought perhaps it would be best if I moved on." "You saw Randall in San Antonio. What did he say to you?" "He made it very clear that my attentions toward you were unwelcome and potentially damaging to your reputation," Hayes replied. "He suggested that your father was merely being polite due to the circumstances of our meeting, but actually considered me an unsuitable associate for his daughter. And you believed him? Daisy asked incredulously. After all the times my father has welcomed you into our home. Hayes looked uncomfortable. Prescott was persuasive. He mentioned specific concerns your father had allegedly expressed about my influence on you. They were lies, Daisy said firmly. Father has never spoken a word against you. In fact, when I refused Randall's proposal, Father supported my decision completely. You refused him? Hayes asked, surprise evident in his voice. Of course I did, Daisy replied. How could I accept him when my heart is elsewhere engaged? The admission hung in the air between them, bold and undeniable. Hayes studied her face, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. Daisy, he began, then hesitated. What I wanted to discuss with you and your father. I was going to ask permission to court you properly. But Prescott's warnings made me question whether such a request would be welcome. It would be most welcome, Daisy said softly, by both my father and myself. Hayes reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his battered condition. I have little to offer compared to a man like Prescott. My ranch is growing, but it's still a hard-scrabble life. You'd be giving up many comforts. I'd be gaining much more, Daisy replied, squeezing his hand. Purpose, partnership, a life built on honest feeling rather than social convention. The door opened then, and Daniel Zimmerman entered the room. He observed their clasped hands with a raised eyebrow but made no comment. I've just come from a meeting with Edward Prescott, he announced, an illuminating conversation. And, Daisy prompted when her father paused. And young Randall will be departing for their Houston office tomorrow. A sudden transfer that Edward assures me was planned weeks ago. Daniel's tone made it clear he didn't believe this explanation for a moment. As for your attackers, Xavier, Sheriff Blake has arrested 2 men who were spending rather freely at the saloon today. They've implicated Randall as having hired them. Will charges be filed? Hayes asked. Daniel sighed. That remains to be seen. The Prescotts have considerable influence, and proof of Randall's direct involvement may be difficult to establish conclusively. However, Edward has offered substantial compensation for your injuries and has personally guaranteed there will be no further incidents. Bought his son's way out of trouble, Hayes observed grimly. Justice takes many forms, especially in places still forming their institutions, Daniel replied pragmatically. The important thing is that you're safe, the immediate threat is removed, and the community understands that such behavior will not be tolerated. He paused, glancing between Hayes and his daughter. Now, I believe you two were in the midst of an important conversation when I interrupted. Hayes straightened despite his injuries, meeting Daniel's gaze directly. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to court your daughter. Daniel appeared to consider the request, though the slight twinkle in his eye suggested he'd anticipated it. You understand that courting Daisy means considering a future together. I won't have my daughter's affections trifled with. I understand completely, Hayes replied solemnly. My intentions are serious and honorable. And you, Daisy? Daniel asked, turning to his daughter. This is what you want? With all my heart, Daisy answered without hesitation. Daniel nodded slowly. Then you have my blessing, though I suggest waiting until you're fully recovered, Xavier, before engaging in any strenuous courtship activities. Yes, sir, Hayes agreed, relief and joy evident in his expression despite his injuries. As Daniel left them alone again, Daisy moved to sit on the edge of the bed, carefully avoiding Hayes's injured side. So, she said softly, it seems I'm to be courted by a horse breeder. If you'll have me, Hayes replied, reaching up to touch her cheek gently. I believe I made my position quite clear, Daisy said with a smile. Though I do have one condition. Name it. Promise me you'll never again listen to anyone else's version of my feelings or intentions. If you have questions or concerns, come directly to me. Hayes nodded solemnly. I promise. No more misunderstandings between us. Good, Daisy said, leaning forward to place a gentle kiss on his forehead. Now rest. You have a courtship to prepare for, and I expect it to be memorable. Hayes's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks. Though he initially protested staying at the Zimmerman home, the practicality of remaining close to the doctor's care and to Daisy eventually convinced him to accept their hospitality until his ribs had healed sufficiently for the ride back to his ranch. During this time, the courtship began in earnest, though in an unconventional manner. Unable to take Daisy on traditional outings, Hayes instead introduced her to his world through stories and plans. They spent hours together in the garden or parlor, Hayes describing his vision for expanding the ranch, while Daisy shared her ideas for establishing the school and improving life in Eagle Pass. Daniel Zimmerman, observing their growing attachment, began including Hayes in discussions about his banking business and investments, subtly mentoring the younger man while assessing his aptitude for financial matters. You have good instincts, Daniel commented one evening as they reviewed the prospectus for a railroad venture. You see beyond the immediate opportunity to consider the longer implications. Ranch work teaches you to think about next year's grass, not just today's, Hayes replied. One decision affects many seasons to come. By the time Hayes was well enough to return to his ranch, the courtship had evolved into a partnership of minds and hearts. When he departed the Zimmerman home, it was with an open invitation to return as often as his business allowed. Over the following months, Hayes proved himself an attentive and creative suitor. Though his responsibilities at the ranch kept him busy, he made time to court Daisy, properly driving her to picnics along the river, well away from dangerous currents, escorting her to church services and town gatherings, and bringing her to his ranch to watch the progress as new buildings rose and foals were born. For her part, Daisy threw herself into learning about ranch operations, surprising Hayes with her practical questions and willingness to understand every aspect of the business. She began riding with him regularly, discovering a natural affinity for horsemanship that delighted them both. You sit a horse as if you were born to it, Hayes remarked during one of their rides across his property. Most town ladies perch like they're afraid of falling. Perhaps I was meant for this life all along, Daisy replied, urging her mare into a canter alongside his stallion. As summer turned to autumn, their courtship deepened. The town of Eagle Pass watched with interest as the banker's daughter and the horse breeder grew increasingly devoted to each other. There were whispers of disapproval from some quarters, particularly among those who had aligned themselves with the Prescotts, but Daniel Zimmerman's obvious approval silenced most criticism. One crisp October afternoon, Hayes arrived at the Zimmerman home looking unusually formal in his best suit. "I'd like to speak with your father," he told Daisy when she greeted him at the door. "Privately, if possible." The seriousness of his tone sent a flutter of anticipation through Daisy. "He's in his study. Shall I tell him you're here?" Hayes nodded, remaining in the parlor while Daisy went to fetch her father. She returned with Daniel, who regarded Hayes with a knowing expression. "Daisy, perhaps you could ask Mrs. Reeves to bring us some coffee," Daniel suggested, clearly giving the men an opportunity to speak alone. Though burning with curiosity, Daisy obliged, taking her time in the kitchen to give them ample time for their discussion. When she finally returned with the coffee tray, both men were standing, shaking hands with expressions of satisfaction. "Is everything all right?" Daisy asked, setting down the tray. "More than all right," Daniel replied, looking genuinely pleased. "Hayes has something he'd like to ask you. I'll leave you two alone." As her father departed, closing the parlor doors behind him, Daisy turned to Hayes expectantly. "Well, Mr. Xavier, what was so important that you needed Father's private audience?" Hayes stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I asked for his blessing to make you my wife." Though Daisy had suspected this might be his purpose, hearing the words spoken aloud sent a rush of joy through her. "And did he give it?" "He did," Hayes confirmed, his gray-blue eyes searching her face. "But his blessing matters less to me than your answer. Daisy Zimmerman, from the moment I pulled you from that river, my life has had new purpose and meaning. You've challenged me, inspired me, and shown me what true partnership could be." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, producing a small ring with a delicate sapphire set in gold. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Daisy replied without hesitation. "Yes, Hayes Xavier, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Daisy marveled at how perfectly it fit both the ring and the man who offered it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "How did you know?" "Your father helped," Hayes admitted. "It belonged to your grandmother. He thought you might prefer a family heirloom to something new." Tears of happiness welled in Daisy's eyes. He was right. "It's perfect." Hayes drew her gently into his arms, mindful that they were in her father's parlor with the doors closed but not locked. "There's something else I should tell you," he said. "Your father has offered to invest in expanding the ranch. With his support, we can build the larger house sooner and increase the breeding stock significantly." "Did he?" Daisy asked, surprised but pleased by her father's gesture. "That's wonderful, Hayes. But would you have asked me even without his investment?" "I would have asked if all I had was the cabin and a single horse," Hayes replied earnestly. "The timing might have been different, but not the question." Their wedding was planned for the following spring, allowing time for Hayes to complete the new main house on the ranch and for Daisy to prepare for her new life. Daniel insisted on providing a generous dowry, most of which was invested directly into the ranch operations at Daisy's request. Throughout the winter, Daisy divided her time between helping Hayes with ranch plans and establishing the school she had long envisioned for Eagle Pass. With her father's influence and her own determination, she secured a building and hired a teacher to begin classes after the new year. "You've accomplished what many thought impossible," Hayes told her when the school officially opened in January 1876. "The children of this town will be better for your efforts." "It's only a beginning," Daisy replied. "Once we're married and settled, I hope to continue supporting education from our ranch. Perhaps eventually we can establish a lending library for the outlying farms and ranches." Hayes smiled at her enthusiasm. "Mrs. Xavier, the educator of the frontier. I like the sound of that." As their wedding day approached, the new house on the ranch neared completion. Built of sturdy stone and timber with large windows overlooking the valley, it was designed to serve as the heart of a growing operation and a growing family. "What do you think?" Hayes asked as he showed Daisy through the nearly finished rooms. "Will it suit you?" Daisy turned slowly, taking in the spacious kitchen, the comfortable parlor with its stone fireplace, the dining room large enough to host guests, and the airy bedrooms upstairs. "It's perfect, Hayes. Truly perfect. There's room for children," he said quietly, watching her expression. "When the time comes." Daisy moved to his side, slipping her arm through his. "I hope that time comes soon after we're married." Their wedding day dawned clear and beautiful on the first Saturday in April 1876. The ceremony was held in the small church in Eagle Pass, filled to capacity with townspeople and ranchers from the surrounding area. Judge Wilson, who had become a staunch supporter of their match, officiated the service. Daisy wore a gown of ivory silk that her mother had helped design before her passing, with small adjustments made by the local dressmaker. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Hayes waiting at the altar, she felt complete certainty that she was moving toward the life she was meant to live. Hayes, resplendent in a new black suit, watched her approach with undisguised adoration. When Daniel placed Daisy's hand in his, the moment felt sacred, a true joining of lives and purposes. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love, honor, and support each other through whatever challenges and joys life might bring. As Hayes slipped the gold band onto Daisy's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and confident. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Wilson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The reception that followed at the Zimmerman home was a joyous celebration, with music, dancing, and abundant food and drink. Daniel Zimmerman spared no expense in honoring his daughter and new son-in-law, even arranging for a photographer from San Antonio to document the occasion. As evening fell, Hayes and Daisy departed for their new home, accompanied by the well wishes and teasing calls of their guests. The journey to the ranch was made magical by the light of a full moon and the shared anticipation of beginning their life together. Martha and Thomas had prepared the house for their arrival, with lamps lit and a fire burning in the hearth to ward off the spring evening's chill. Fresh flowers adorned the tables, and the new curtains Daisy had sewn hung at the windows. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," Hayes said as he carried her across the threshold, a tradition he'd insisted on observing despite Daisy's laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. "It's wonderful to finally be here as your wife," Daisy replied as he set her gently on her feet. "Our home. Our life together." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered a new dimension to their love, a physical connection that complemented their emotional and intellectual bond. Hayes proved as tender and attentive in intimacy as he was in all other aspects of their relationship, guiding Daisy through initial nervousness to shared pleasure and deep contentment. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, Daisy resting her head on Hayes's chest, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that day at the river?" she asked softly. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't decided to water your horse at that particular bend." Hayes stroked her hair, his touch reverent. "I've thought of it often. Some might call it chance or coincidence, but I believe it was providence. We were meant to find each other, Daisy. Even if it required me nearly drowning," she teased gently. "I would have preferred a less dangerous introduction," Hayes admitted with a chuckle, "but I wouldn't change the outcome for all the world." The early years of their marriage established patterns of partnership and mutual support that would sustain them through decades together. Hayes's horse breeding operation flourished with Daisy's organizational skills, complementing his expertise with the animals. Their reputation for quality stock spread beyond Texas, bringing buyers from as far as Kentucky and California. Daisy continued her educational efforts, establishing a small library at the ranch that served not only their household but neighboring families as well. Once a week, she taught reading and arithmetic to the children of their workers and nearby ranchers, fulfilling her desire to extend learning beyond the town limits. In the spring of 1877, their joy was multiplied when Daisy discovered she was expecting their first child. Hayes's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for, pure delight tempered with protective concern for her well-being. "You'll need to slow down," he insisted, immediately rearranging her workload and hiring additional help for the house. No more riding until after the baby comes. Daisy laughingly resisted some of his more extreme precautions. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Hayes. I'm not made of porcelain. Humor me, he replied, kissing her forehead. This is our first child. I'm entitled to be a bit overprotective. Their son, Daniel Hayes Xavier, was born on a cold December night with Martha serving as midwife and Hayes pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When finally allowed to enter, Hayes approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Daisy's arms. "Meet your son," Daisy said softly, tired but radiant with new motherhood. "He has your eyes, I think." Hayes gently touched the infant's tiny hand, his expression one of wonder when the baby's fingers curled reflexively around his own. "He's perfect," he whispered, "just like his mother." The following years brought further blessings: a daughter, Elizabeth Sarah, born in 1879, and another son, James Thomas, in 1882. The Xavier Ranch expanded accordingly, with additional land purchased and new breeding lines established. Hayes's reputation as one of the finest horse breeders in Texas was firmly secured, while Daisy became known for her educational initiatives and eventually helped establish a proper boarding school in Eagle Pass. Daniel Zimmerman was a frequent visitor to the ranch, delighting in his grandchildren and taking pride in the success of the operation he had helped build. When he passed away peacefully in 1885, he left his banking interests to a trusted colleague, but divided his personal fortune between Daisy and several charitable causes she had championed. "He lived to see us happy," Daisy said at his funeral, drawing comfort from Hayes's steady presence beside her. "That's what mattered most to him in the end." "He gave me his greatest treasure," Hayes replied, his arm around her shoulders, "and his trust. I hope I proved worthy of both." As their children grew, the ranch prospered further. Young Daniel showed his father's gift with horses, while Elizabeth inherited her mother's passion for education, eventually becoming a teacher herself. James, the youngest, developed an unexpected talent for business, helping to expand the Xavier breeding operation into one of the largest in Texas. Through it all, Hayes and Daisy maintained the deep connection that had begun that fateful day by the river. Their partnership weathered the inevitable challenges of life droughts that threatened their livelihood, illnesses that caused sleepless nights of worry, disagreements that required patience and compromise to resolve. One evening in the summer of 1895, 20 years after their first meeting, Hayes found Daisy sitting on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were grown now, Daniel running the day-to-day operations of the ranch with his own wife and young son, Elizabeth teaching at the school in town and courting a promising young doctor, James studying business at a university in Austin. Hayes sat beside his wife, taking her hand in his as he had countless times over the years. At 48, Daisy's beauty had matured but not diminished. Laugh lines around her eyes and strands of silver in her honey-blonde hair only added character to her face. "What are you thinking about so intently?" he asked, following her gaze across the ranch that had been their life's work together. "I was remembering the day we met," Daisy replied, squeezing his hand. "How frightened I was in that river and how certain I was that I would die there. And then—" Hayes prompted, though he knew the story well. "And then a strong pair of arms pulled me from the current, and a voice I didn't yet know promised that I was safe." Daisy turned to look at him, love evident in her expression. "Little did I know that voice would become the most beloved sound in my world." Hayes leaned forward to kiss her gently. At 53, His dark hair was liberally streaked with gray, and the years of physical labor had left their mark on his body. Yet his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that had first captured Daisy's attention, remained clear and direct, still regarding her with the same devotion they had shown from the beginning. "Would you believe me if I told you I fell in love with you that very day?" he asked. "Soaking wet and half-drowned as you were, something in me recognized something in you." "I would believe you," Daisy replied, "because something in me recognized you too, even before I fully understood what that recognition meant." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, hands clasped, surrounded by the ranch they had built together and the life they had created from a chance encounter and a brave decision made without hesitation. "I've been thinking," Hayes said after a comfortable silence. "Now that the children are grown and Daniel is managing things so capably, perhaps we should consider that trip we've talked about. See some of the country beyond Texas." "I'd like that," Daisy agreed. "Though this will always be home." "Home is wherever we're together," Hayes replied simply. "It has been since the moment I carried you from that river." Daisy rested her head against his shoulder, her heart full with the certainty that the current which had once threatened her life had ultimately carried her exactly where she was meant to be, into the arms of a man brave enough to dive in without a second thought, and loving enough to create a lifetime of safety and joy from that single, selfless act.